deal. I'm like a little cocky. I'm thinking, okay, like I got a record deal, and he's playing with Rick Derringer, but he doesn't have a record deal. So
There was a time when a woman's voice wasn't supposed to sound like that on rock radio, too sharp, too powerful, too unwilling to bend. And yet when Pat Benatar stepped up to the microphone, she didn't just sing. She confronted. Every note carried something heavier than melody, something closer to defiance. For audiences across America in the late 1970s and early 80s, her voice didn't feel polished or safe. It felt dangerous. But what made that voice so unforgettable wasn't just the range, or the precision, or even the hits that would come to define an era. It was the tension behind it. Because long before the platinum records and sold-out arenas, there were doors quietly closing in her face, and men in powerful rooms who didn't quite know what to do with a woman who refused to play by their rules. You could hear it in songs like Heartbreaker and Hit Me With Your Best Shot, the controlled fire, the sense that every lyric was aimed at someone real. And in many ways, it was. Behind the stage lights and chart-topping success was a series of confrontations, moments where control, credit, and identity were constantly being negotiated and often taken. This wasn't just a rise to fame, it was a series of battles. Some public, and many painfully private. And at the center of it all stood a woman who never quite fit the mold the industry had prepared for her. Because success for her didn't come from being accepted. It came from resisting, and over the years, there were 5 men, 5 names, who would leave marks on her career in ways most fans never fully understood. Some tried to shape her, some tried to control her, and some underestimated her completely. This is the story behind those moments, the quiet conflicts, the power struggles, the names she never truly forgot. And it begins before the fame ever had a chance to feel real. Before the leather outfits, before the Grammy wins, before the name Pat Benatar echoed through arenas across the country, she was simply Patricia May Andrzejewski, a classically trained singer from Brooklyn, born on January 10, 1926. Her voice didn't begin in rock clubs or recording studios. It began in structured rooms shaped by discipline, precision, and a deep respect for technique. She studied opera. She followed the rules, and for a while, it seemed like her path was already decided. But something didn't fit. The world she was trained for demanded control, but not the kind she wanted. It was controlled expression, controlled identity, controlled ambition. And somewhere along the way, she realized that having a powerful voice meant very little if you weren't allowed to use it freely. So she stepped away from that path. Not dramatically, not recklessly, but with a quiet certainty that she needed something more real. That decision didn't lead her straight to success. It led her into small clubs, long nights, and a constant fight to be taken seriously in spaces that weren't built for her. She wasn't trying to be a novelty. She wasn't trying to be a female version of anything. She was trying to be herself, and that alone made people uncomfortable. By the time she began performing in New York's club scene, there was already tension forming around her. Industry insiders saw potential, but they also saw something they wanted to reshape. Her image, her sound. Even the way she carried herself on stage. Everything became a topic of discussion, negotiation, and at times, quiet conflict. And this is where the pattern began. Because as her career slowly gained momentum, the resistance didn't disappear, it evolved. The rooms got bigger. The stakes got higher. And the people around her became more influential. Producers, executives, collaborators, each one bringing opportunities, but also expectations. Some believed they were helping her succeed. Others believed they knew better. And a few simply wanted control. What makes her story different isn't just that she succeeded despite all of this. It's that she never fully surrendered to it. Not completely. Not permanently. Even when compromise seemed necessary, there was always a line she wouldn't cross. And over time, 5 men would come to represent those moments, those turning points where her career could have gone in a very different direction. Some of them stood beside her. Some stood in her way. But all of them changed the course of her story. Number 5. Mike Chapman. The first real shift didn't come quietly. It came dressed as opportunity, and the name attached to it was Mike Chapman. By the time he entered her world, he already carried a reputation for shaping hits, for knowing exactly how to turn raw talent into something the radio couldn't ignore. And on paper, it looked like the moment everything would finally into fumins. A line for Pat Benatar. But alignment wasn't what he was offering, it was direction. Chapman understood the industry better than most. And with that understanding came a very clear vision of what she should sound like, how she should present herself, and where her edges needed to be softened. Because to him, success wasn't accidental, it was engineered. Songs were structured carefully, image was calculated, and nothing was left untouched. At first it worked. The recordings became sharper, more accessible, more immediate. There was a polish that hadn't been there before, and it opened doors that had previously remained closed. Radio stations paid attention, executives leaned in, and the machine began to move. But something else moved with it, something less visible, because with every adjustment, every refinement, there was a quiet question lingering beneath the surface about how much of her was still hers. Chapman wasn't aggressive. He didn't need to be. His authority came from success, from experience, from the unspoken understanding that he knew how to make stars. And in that kind of environment, resistance didn't look like rebellion. It looked like hesitation, a pause in the studio, a disagreement over a vocal take, a subtle pushback that never fully disappeared. For an artist whose identity was rooted in control over her voice, that tension mattered because it wasn't just about how the songs sounded, it was about what they represented. And yet walking away wasn't an option, not then. So she stayed adapted, where she had to, but she also watched, learned, and slowly began to understand the system she was inside, realizing that success often came with invisible negotiations, and this would not be the last time she found herself in a room where someone else believed they knew exactly who she should be. Number 4. Clive Davis. If Mike Chapman represented structure, then Clive Davis represented power, not the kind that stood under stage lights, but the kind that decided who deserved to be there in the first place. And by the time Pat Benatar entered his orbit, he had already built a reputation as one of the most influential figures in the industry, a man whose approval could quietly open doors that others didn't even know existed, or just as easily close them without explanation. Their connection was never loud, never explosive, but it carried a weight that didn't need to announce itself, because conversations with Davis were never just conversations. They were direction, expectation, and long-term positioning, wrapped into a few carefully chosen words. For him, success wasn't simply about breaking through. It was about maintaining control once you got there, about shaping an artist into something sustainable, something predictable enough to survive the shifting demands of the market. And that's where the tension began to settle in, not as conflict, but as pressure. Benatar's voice was disciplined, precise, and undeniably powerful, but her identity as an artist wasn't something that could be easily reduced to a formula she resisted. Repetition resisted the idea of becoming a fixed version of herself, and in an environment driven by results, that kind of resistance could feel like risk. Davis saw both potential and unpredictability, and when those two forces meet, decisions become more calculated. Songs are chosen not just for their emotional impact, but for their commercial positioning. Image is shaped not just for authenticity, but for reach. And while none of this was unusual, it created a quiet friction that followed every major step forward. There were moments when the path ahead seemed clearly defined, and others when it felt like she was being guided towards something that didn't fully belong to her, not forced, not demanded, but subtly shaped. And over time, shaping can feel indistinguishable from control. Still, she delivered, she performed, she met the expectations placed in front of her, but beneath it all, there remained an awareness growing stronger with each decision, a sense that the higher she climbed, the less room there was to move freely. And Clive Davis, without ever raising his voice, became a photo symbol of that realization that some of the most powerful forces in a career are the ones you never directly confront, but always have to navigate. Number 3. Neil Geraldo. By the time Neil Geraldo stepped fully into her world, the dynamic changed in a way that no executive or producer had managed to do before, because he wasn't observing from a distance or guiding from behind a console. He was inside the music itself, shaping it in real time. And for Pat Benatar, that Closeness felt both powerful and complicated. Geraldo didn't try to soften her intensity, he recognized it, understood it, and pushed it forward, turning her sound into something sharper, heavier, more defined. And for the first time, it felt like the music truly matched the force behind her voice, creating a partnership that audiences could feel even if they didn't fully understand it. But when creative connection becomes personal, the balance begins to shift in ways that are harder to control, because collaboration stops being just about the work. It becomes about trust, influence, and shared direction. And that's where the tension quietly formed. Geraldo believed in her, fought for her sound, and stood against pressures that might have diluted what made her unique. But belief doesn't eliminate complexity. And over time, his role grew beyond collaboration, into something deeper, something that touched every part of the process, from how the music sounded to how decisions were made behind the scenes. For someone who had spent years protecting her independence, even the strongest partnership could feel like a negotiation, because shared control is still control, just divided differently, and there were moments where that division didn't feel entirely equal. The success they built together was undeniable. The music connected, the audience responded, and from the outside, it looked like a perfect alignment of vision and execution. But inside that success was a quieter reality, one where boundaries had to be constantly redefined, where personal connection and professional direction didn't always move at the same pace. And yet she remained in it. Not out of obligation, but because what they created mattered, because it worked, and because walking away from something that powerful isn't simple. Still, the experience left its mark, reinforcing a truth she was beginning to understand more clearly, that even the closest alliances can carry tension. And sometimes, the hardest conflicts are not with those who oppose you, but with those who stand beside you. Number 2. Keith Olsen. By the time Keith Olsen entered the picture, the expectations surrounding Pat Benatar had reached a level where success was no longer a breakthrough, it was a requirement, and every decision carried the pressure of maintaining that position. Olsen was known for precision, for his ability to take a sound and refine it until it translated perfectly, not just emotionally, but commercially. And in an industry built on consistency, that kind of skill was invaluable. Under his influence, the music became tighter, more structured, every element carefully placed, every performance guided toward a specific outcome. And on the surface, it all made sense because the results were there. The record sold, the audience stayed engaged, and everything appeared to be working exactly as intended. But precision has a cost, and over time, that cost began to reveal itself in subtle ways, because the more controlled the sound became, the less space there was for unpredictability. The very thing that had made her voice stand out in the first place. There were moments in the studio where instinct met structure, where a performance that felt right in the moment was adjusted, refined, reshaped, and while those changes were never extreme, they accumulated, creating a quiet distance between what was felt and what was delivered. Olsen wasn't trying to erase her identity like others. Before him, he believed he was strengthening it, making it more effective, more reliable, more aligned with what the industry demanded. But success shaped too carefully can start to lose its connection to its source. For Benatar, this wasn't a breaking point, it was a realization, another piece of a pattern she had been living through since the beginning. Different people, different approaches, but the same underlying question about how much control she could truly keep. And by now, she understood that this wasn't something that would simply resolve itself. It was part of the structure she was working within. And Keith Olsen became another chapter in that understanding, reinforcing the idea that the higher the expectations, the tighter the control, and the harder it becomes to hold on to what made you different in the first place. Number 1. Dennis Benatar. Long before the contracts, the studios, and the name Pat Benatar carried any weight, there was Dennis Benatar. And unlike the others, his role in her story had nothing to do with the music industry. It was rooted in something far more personal, something that existed before ambition had fully taken shape. Their life together followed a structure that felt stable, predictable, and grounded in a reality that didn't require risk, a world where expectations were clear and the future seemed defined. And for a time, that clarity was enough. But as her voice began to grow beyond that environment, as the idea of pursuing music shifted from possibility to necessity, the distance between those two worlds started to widen, not through conflict, but through change. The life she was moving toward demanded uncertainty, independence, and a willingness to step into spaces that didn't offer guarantees, and that kind of transformation doesn't easily fit within a structure built on stability. Dennis represented a version of life that made sense, one that didn't leave much room for the kind of risks she was beginning to take. And while there was no dramatic breaking point, there was a quiet realization that the path ahead could not include everything she had once held onto. For Benatar, this became the first true boundary she had to define, not with executives or producers, but with her own past. With the expectations that existed before anyone ever tried to shape her voice or her image. Walking away from that kind of foundation carries a different kind of weight, because it isn't just about career decisions. It's about identity, about choosing who you are, becoming over who you have been, and accepting that growth. Often requires leaving behind something that once felt secure. Dennis Benatar didn't try to control her career. But the life they shared represented a form of limitation she could no longer accept, and in many ways, this was where everything truly began. Because before she could navigate the pressures of the industry, she had to step away from the life that asked her not to. By the time the spotlight settled and success became something familiar, Pat Benatar had already faced the battles that would define her, not the ones seen on stage or written into headlines, but the quieter conflicts that shaped every decision behind the scenes. Each name along her journey left an imprint, some offering opportunity, others bringing pressure, and a few blurring the line between support and control, but none of them ever fully defined who she became. What remains isn't just the music, but the consistency of something deeper, a refusal to disappear inside expectations, even when compromise seemed easier, even when the system around her demanded it. Her voice carried more than melody, it carried history. Every note shaped by choices that weren't always visible, by moments where holding on to identity required more strength than letting go. That's why it still resonates, not just because of how it sounds, but because of what it represents. A career built not only on talent but on resistance, on the quiet determination to remain intact in an environment designed to reshape everything it touches. And long after the charts have changed and the industry has moved on, that part of her story remains untouched because the most important battles are rarely the loudest ones. They are the ones that decide who you are allowed to become, and in the end, that is the part no one else ever gets to. Control